and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to the Millennial Roundtable for Point of View. I'm your host today, Chelsey Youman, and I'm so excited for the panel we have lined up today. We have a stellar group of millennials and all women, incidentally, which I think is the first time I've ever hosted the table with all women. So I'm glad you guys are here. We have our first time panelists today. We have Annie Brown with us. She's on the government relations team. She's the government program manager for an organization called Youman Coalition. Youman Coalition is a network of clinics serving pregnant women in need throughout the entire country, really trying to help save children, save lives through serving women. So thank you for being with us today, Annie.
Happy to be here.
We are so excited to have you. And then we also, of course, have, she's no stranger to you, Peyton Luke. She's the media director at Cross Timbers Church. And Peyton always brings such a refreshing perspective. She has a depth of knowledge and wealth of knowledge. So thank you for joining us again today, Peyton.
Thank you, Chelsey. That's a kind introduction.
Oh, yeah. So I'm just happy to be with you guys. I think we have some really heavy topics. It's probably the heaviest I've ever felt, frankly, going into the Millennial Roundtable with everything going on in Afghanistan right now. And so we're really going to dive into it, of course, from our millennial perspectives. We are, just old enough to have remembered September 11th, to have been deeply impacted in our psyches, our consciences, and our values, and even our political spectrums. All of that was in our formative years. For me, I was in the 8th grade. Where were you guys at September 11th age?
I was in 5th grade.
5th grade.
I was like 6.
Okay, so Peyton may not remember that much. But I'm saying all of that to say that we were deeply impacted and definitely remember the war in Iraq and then Afghanistan. We remember as millennials when President Obama did finally kill Osama bin Laden. All of that is something that was really impactful to us, whereas Gen Z was a little bit younger and wouldn't remember that. My cousin, for instance, was born on September 11th, the actual day. So she has no memory or recollection of all of this. But we are young enough not to remember 1991 as much or where all of this started. We definitely don't remember Vietnam because we were not here during that. And so there's a world stage and a lot of dynamics at play when we're having these discussions that we've booked up on. But we're going to start with Afghanistan. I think it's something that's really important. I'll start with, first and foremost, to me, what has the moral priority, which is the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding, has already happened. And then where we anticipate that leading. So in terms of churchgoers, the underground church there, and of course women and children, the impact to them. And then we'll head on to a little bit of the policy discussion. We are going to get into politics, international relations, which I'm going to do my best to channel. I have a half degree in international relations. So I do actually remember a lot from those discussions, how Afghanistan really is the focal point of a proxy war. This is not about a siloed country. When you're talking about international relations, that it's a national impact, what we're seeing. This isn't just going to impact Afghanistan, which of course all of you know. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later in the show. And then finally, we're going to end on some other news. There was a New York Times article that I found very profound. I was surprised, first of all, to see it in the New York Times. It's called A Guide to Faith, and it's really an approach to religion and faith from almost like a rationality, apologetics, atheist perspective. And I think it was a poignant piece. And so I want us to cover that. I have my own op-ed article that was published in National Review over the weekend about SB 8 out of Texas, the Texas Heartbeat Bill, which will go into effect September 1, and the impact that's going to have on limiting abortions for children with heartbeats in the womb. So we'll get to all of that and more in our second hour. Of course, you can read up on these articles on pointofview.net. You can go to Facebook and watch us live. Leave your comments. We will love to hear from you. But let's dive right in. We're going to start with Afghanistan. I think our audience knows, everybody knows, you and I, what's been happening and how that's unfolded. That in essentially 11 days, the Taliban did a walk across Afghanistan and completely took over. And the U.S. retreat started in May. And so from May until now, our troops were leaving. There was an incredibly fast fall of Afghanistan into terrorist hands. So Afghanistan is officially going to be a terrorist country. We all know that. And it's for the first time in 20 years. They did have a 5-year rule before they took over, but it looked really different then. So back before we started the war in 1991, they ruled for 5 years. They are fundamentalists, they're terrorists, and they rule on control and power with fundamentalist ideals as Shiite Muslims, which is different than Shia Muslims, who are a little bit less traditional and kind of, as Christians, we would say, like the Old Testament fundamentalist values, or Orthodox Jews. You know, the Shia Muslims are a little bit more modern. Women were able to be educated in the last 20 years, go to school, have jobs, did not have to wear burqas in the streets. And so the life and freedoms that for now 20 years, that's 2 decades. For us as millennials, that would have been us around the time September 11th happened, obviously, you know, we having freedom all of that time. So there's a lot to unpack here. Annie, what do you have to say just from a high level even of what you're reading and where we've been?
Well, you know, I was having some discussions last night, and something that stood out to me that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't initially considered was, you know, like you were saying, it's now been 20 years. You have individuals who are, you know, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. That's all they know. Mm-hmm. They grew up in that. And then to have everything, you know, flipped overnight is rather reminiscent of what happened in Iran in 1979, I believe, 78. And when overnight everything was completely flipped and people who had absolutely no recollection of life beforehand. And so it might be met with a little bit more resistance, but how long that resistance lasts, I think, is really up in the air.
Well, you are right. So we know as of yesterday, we saw the first resistance forming in the news. Now, this is an hour by hour development. So I frankly don't know what has happened in the last 6 hours. But as of yesterday, I saw these images of women holding up signs in the faces of the Taliban. They are going to the streets in certain regions. Now, at first, they were not responding with violence. The Taliban are laying low. We hear they're a very patient group. And so the Taliban are, I've heard, going to wait from experts for weeks for us to leave, and that's when they're going to start their executions. But for now, they were at least allowing people to take the streets. And then I do know as of last night, there had been some violence developing and a few people killed in some of the protests. But I hope you're right. I hope this spirit of freedom that they've had, you know, I hope they're emboldened even in the face of seeing their own government officials flee. Peyton, we have a quick minute left, but, you know, would you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. The Taliban are very patient. They're very intelligent. They're not just, you know, some farmers or whatever else. They have been putting this together. They've been preparing for the American troops to leave. What's so interesting, Sun Tzu and even The Art of War says the supreme victory lies in beating your enemy before combat is engaged. So they've been waiting, and they didn't even have to put up a major fight. You know, they had agreements with America that the American troops would withdraw if there wasn't violence, and we saw violence in some ways starting to amp up, and they weren't completely keeping all their agreements. But overall, it's very interesting to see all of this play out.
Yes, it's devastating, obviously, for the people. So when we get back after this short break, we are going to talk about some of the stories we're hearing from people on the ground, from journalists there who are reporting live what is happening, and then, you know, what our response as Christians is to everything going on. So don't go anywhere.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Two professors, one in the field of medicine and the other in the field of economics, explain why we'll never eradicate the COVID virus. Although this should be obvious, they felt the need to write an essay to explain this and show the fallacy of many government policies. Let's first look at some of the countries that have had the most extensive lockdowns. China has the most severe, even locking people into their homes and imposing a 40-day quarantine at gunpoint. New Zealand also had a very extensive lockdown with sharp restrictions on international travel, business closures, and even a prohibition about going outside. Australia banned international travel, closed schools, and engaged in a brutal suppression of protests. They had limited success, but the virus came back. So did the lockdowns. The medical issue is easy to explain. We won't be able to eradicate the COVID virus or any other coronavirus. The lone human infectious disease we've deliberately eradicated is smallpox. The bacterium responsible for the Black Death, the 14th century outbreak of the bubonic plague, is still with us, causing infections even in the U.S. On radio, I've tried to explain why we were able to eradicate smallpox, but we won't be able to eradicate this virus. This coronavirus is also carried by animals. To eliminate it, we would also have to rid ourselves of dogs, cats, bats, and other animals. And it might also add that only 15% of the world's population have received the vaccine. We may not like hearing that we have to live with the virus, but that is reality, and our public policy needs to be based on that reality. A focused protection policy can help deal with the risk, but it is time to face the fact that a zero COVID policy cannot be achieved. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host today, Chelsey Youman, and we are talking about Afghanistan. I mean, it's such a historic week, a terrible week, and there's a lot of things unfolding quickly, so we want to make sure we talk about it on the show. We're going to start with women and children, I think, because I said we wanted to start with the humanitarian crisis. That's the moral priority here. We have heard many stories are coming out through journalists, people on the ground, and even reaching out. For instance, Senator Cotton put out an alert that said, if you're a U.S. citizen in Afghanistan, you can contact us. I mean, they're saying there's probably between 30 and 50,000 Americans there right now. And that doesn't even include, all of the U.S., British, the Allied forces allies in Afghanistan who they're saying they anticipate being executed in droves within the first few weeks of internationals leaving. And so what we've been told is the Taliban has reached out to house churches and sent letters to them widely saying, we know you're here and we'll be back. They have asked anyone with a female child or a young girl who is 15 years old or older to put an X on their door. And they are women disappearing in the streets already. So traditionally, the Taliban will take women and children as wives, and essentially it's really a horrific life that they lead. They've already killed at least one woman we know in the street for not wearing a burqa in accordance with their fundamentalist values in public. So we're looking at really some horrific things that are going to shake out in the next few weeks. We said a little bit earlier on this segment, the Taliban are very patient, and so they will do these things over time. And one thing that I would like to know before I kick it over to you girls is that the Taliban is also, they're not the old Taliban from 20 years ago that ruled, where it was kind of a free for all. They're a little bit, I think, they're more strategic now from what it sounds like. They understand infrastructure is going to be important, energy is going to be important, and they're saying that they're willing to work with international countries. So they're trying to be seen as a more valid terrorist state, essentially, but a more valid country. And so they're seeking to be recognized. And that's one of the reasons they might be a little bit slower on the front end to implementing all these horrific changes they're going to be implementing. But we know that the people of Afghanistan, they know who the Taliban are, as evidenced by the scene we've all seen that is in our brains from the Kabul airport, and just the absolute sheer panic and terror in their faces. So, Annie, I'm going to start with you. Have you heard similar things or anything additional about what's happening down there, and what are your thoughts?
Oh, yeah. Well, so this morning I was actually listening to an interview from Sky, I believe it was Sky News, and she was speaking with their media, the head of their media, so to speak. And she was asking him, okay, well, what does this mean for women? Now, everything, all the language that they've put forth in any sort of interview has always been very, very vague. They said, well, of course women will have rights, but it's all according to, Sharia law. Well, then, what does that mean? Well, that just depends on the individuals that they have put in place to interpret it. So you can interpret it in very liberal ways, and you can interpret it in very conservative ways. So, you have the Iraqis, and they interpret it one way, and then you have, the Iranians, and they interpret it a very, very different way. So, they'll say, well, of course women can be educated. Well, what does education mean to you? And of course they'll have rights. Well, what do rights mean? Are they required to, to cover their face? Does a woman have a choice when they go out in public? Well, and then to his response on that, well, these women, this is what they want. They're Muslim women. This is what they choose, and they choose to live by Sharia law, and and we will enact that. But again, they remain very, very vague on it.
Yes, and there's a sordid history there. I saw, this is really graphic, but it's the reality. And so I think it's important for us all as Americans, for you and I, to look at what's going on in the face and call it what it is and the reality of what it is. And there was an article from the Time magazine from literally, I think it was 14 years ago, and it was a woman, and her nose had been cut off because she had talked back to her someone in her household, and she wasn't respectful. And so it was a horrific thing, but that's the reality of a Taliban run nation and how they operate. I've heard they're cutting off the hands of robbers already. And so this is fundamentalist. This is not the type of typical Islamic faith that we see even in America here. I grew up in a school that had, I think, a 50 to 60% Muslim and Hindu population. So I grew up in a very international environment. I think there were 30 languages spoken in our hallways. So many of my friends growing up before 9/11 were Muslim, and they are not, it's not the same. They're not fundamentalists, it's different. So what, Peyton, have you seen that kind of has really stuck out to you as a Christian, as a millennial, that's cause for concern?
Sure. Well, even just the word Islam means submission. Peace and submission. And to your point, Annie, there's a difference in the definition there on the peace and how are you really going to approach that. But it's interesting because I was also watching an interview with the spokesperson of the Taliban, and they're like asking questions. Is it going to be different for women? Is it going to be different for education and everything? And he's like, well, yes, but he didn't elaborate. And I also saw an interview with Sky News, and there was this woman coming up to the reporter, and she's just like begging them to let her through because it was outside the airport. And her husband had joined the Taliban. He had been beating her at home, and it was just like, and she was there with like her 4-year-old daughter, and it's like, please, I just have to get through. You saw all these people with their paperwork. And then I saw another interview and all, which was through BBC, and literally 1 meter away on the other side of a barbed wire fence was the Taliban. On the other side was the British soldiers, and they were almost making discretionary calls of like letting people through or the paperwork. And you just saw these people begging them, and some of them, they had to turn them away just because their paperwork wasn't right or set up. And it's just really, really sad situation.
It's devastating, and it's one that is entirely preventable, and we we are going to talk about that. I mean, how all of this, it could have been prevented. There are blueprints out there. There were ways to do this. And this is just a complete abomination on an international scale. But the real victims are going to be those women and children and people left behind. And we're at least seeing, they're saying that the Taliban is part of this international play they're doing to try to be seen as legitimized, are working, quote unquote, with the allied forces and, allowing the people to go out. But we know that the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. State Department sent out an email to Americans in Afghanistan and said, you guys stay in your homes for a while. Don't come to Kabul yet. We'll tell you when it's ready. Then they sent an email that said, okay, come to Kabul airport. We're only going to be able to evacuate people from the Kabul airport, but not from your outlier towns. Oh, by the way, we can't guarantee your safety in your travel. Mm-hmm. And so it is a farce. I mean, everything we're hearing from our government at this point, it seems to be shrouded in lies, but that we do still have American citizens who are there, who were told they're going to be evacuated safely, who are sitting in their homes at the behest of the State Department saying, sit in your homes. Well, because you sat in your home and now you're not at Kabul, we can't evacuate you. So this is just such a debacle. It's horrible. And we sincerely, not only am I frustrated, but I'm heartbroken. I'm heartbroken for the people in Afghanistan. I'm heartbroken for our soldiers who served, and to anyone who served in Afghanistan. I just want to say thank you, because it didn't just mean anything to us as a country who is free, that you protected us and tried to keep us safe. But for 20 years, you created safety and a haven in Afghanistan as much as you could have for a people, for a generation to understand what freedom is and to know what education is and to have not feared like they're fearing now. And that sacrifice mattered. And just because this week, things have unfolded the way they have. I mean, that sacrifice was just so venerable and so honorable, and something that I know we are grateful for. And my hope is that there can be some level of oversight, that this isn't just a complete retreat. I know that we influxed our soldiers this week by 1,000, and I know the international community is talking about making their own decisions without us in NATO. I heard a British commentator say, maybe it's time to leave the U.S. and not let the U.S. be the key driver anymore on some of this. And so maybe it won't all be on us. Maybe there will still be some humanitarian things offered. Annie?
Yeah, no, I mean, on that, I think my very first reaction to all of this going down was a punch in the gut. I was listening to, Shapiro's analysis of all of this and describing what our allies are going through and how we did not prioritize their exit. And just honestly thinking about the drivers, the translators, the cooks, the people who were, just opening up their homes to Americans and our other allied forces that were there. And I mean, they're left for dead. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, you can have the Taliban make these promises all they want, but I mean, we all know what's going to happen. And
history shows that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And so going forward, it breaks my heart, not only for them, but it makes me so sad for future relationships that America is going to try and build up in the future with other nations. I mean, we have to be able to have our allies trust us ultimately.
Right. A complete lack of trust. Well, when we get back, we are going to break that down into what this means for our allies going forward, and also how could this have been avoided, some things that have been brought to light in the last few days.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, I'm your host today, Chelsey Youman, for the Millennial Roundtable, and I'm joined by Annie Brown and Peyton Luke, and we are just breaking down the horrible events that have unfolded in Afghanistan. We've been talking about the humanitarian crisis there, and talking about how grateful we are for the sacrifice of our soldiers there. But we are going to move on to the broader policy discussion that needs to also be had, which is the wisdom of being there in the first place. There's really two separate issues. Going into Afghanistan and the wisdom of being there at all. And then second, how to leave, which was obviously a complete debacle this week. And Biden is not going to get through this show unscathed by me. So buckle up, everybody. If you would like to call, we would love to hear your voice. You can call in at 800-351-1212. Or you can also leave a comment on Facebook. You can watch us live on Facebook, and you can read our articles today on pointofview.net. So we're going to start now with a little bit of the bigger, broader policy discussion, which is, we were talking in the break, Peyton, about just our like Western worldview. And as a millennial who we have seen so much of the social justice warrior stuff and the whining and complaining over so many issues over the last years. I mean, for me, this like really put all of that into perspective, and just I got so irritated with like Americans whining over these frivolous issues in the public sphere that don't really matter when you're looking at a country over there where people would rather board the outside of a plane and try to hang on to leave than to stay and face the horrors they're about to face. And so it really put things into perspective for me. And I know, Peyton, you had a lot of thoughts on that too.
Yeah, because no matter what side you look at this politically, or if we should have been involved with Afghanistan, if we should or shouldn't withdraw our troops or keep them there, no matter what, real people are being harmed by extremists. And, we know that women don't have the same rights as we were talking earlier. The women between 15 to 45 are going to be taken. The boys are going to be indoctrinated and taught and trained to be soldiers. And, the men are just going to get killed. And so we're looking at these things and it's just so horrific. And it's similar to even World War II and kind of how the Nazis did it. They were patient. They drew it out. It was indoctrination. It was intimidation. It was fear. It was terrorism. And it's like, oh, your current government isn't providing these things for you, isn't providing the food or the education. Well, here, we have a better future for you. Here, trust us. And then, it turns on them with time and that indoctrination. And we as Americans, we look at it and we have a hard time wrapping our minds around how can you just beat people in the streets? How can you just shoot at them? How, have all this terror? And it's interesting because they are looking at the world through a different worldview. Even if America still isn't considered primarily a Christian country, we are still grounded on Judeo-Christian ethics and the right to life, the sanctity of life, the moral absolutes. We still have these things. So it's very interesting because they are looking at the world and approaching things through a completely different worldview. And I think that's why we have a hard time wrapping our minds around it, or just get so, frustrated and built up in it. It's like, okay, this is their worldview and they aren't going to change too. And that's why when they say, oh yeah, things are going to be different, things are going to change. What is their worldview? It is different than ours.
It is. And I think that's such a really, really important point to make, Peyton, that you're making, because at the end of the day, we have to understand not to trust. Like, I will say this about President Trump. He entered into a peace agreement with the Taliban last year. And I mean, they always say that the mantra, don't negotiate with terrorists, but you have to understand in international relations, as our chief commander of the United States of America, who your enemies are and how they're going to act and operate. I mean, you should not be saying on a public stage, we had no idea how fast we thought it was going to happen. We just didn't know how quickly it was going to happen. That should never be the case. We should have this understanding of what you're talking about, that there is a different worldview out there, and there's evil out there, and
they're not going to change overnight.
And they're not a siloed nation in this. I mean, we're going to talk more broadly too, that this is a proxy war. So Afghanistan was a proxy war in the region. Their neighbor is Pakistan, whose typical rival, I would say, in the region is India. Pakistan and India have gone back and forth in history. And Afghanistan was kind of Pakistan's ally. Now Taliban has moved into Pakistan over the last few years and generated things. But so there's a proxy war there. And then Afghanistan was also part of a proxy war because it was only recognized when the Taliban ruled it by a few countries in the Middle East. So the United Arab Emirates, I believe Iran and Pakistan were the only ones to acknowledge it as a legitimized government. Well, now this time around, you mentioned the Taliban is patient. The Taliban wants to be more legitimized on the international scale, which they are now because they overtook the country so quickly. And we are deeply humiliated on a public spectrum because of this. But China and Russia are watching. So this isn't a siloed situation. China the Taliban had been traveling for months to go visit with world leaders in China and Russia. Russia and China have both come out with statements supporting the Taliban. China has their eye on some mineral resources there that are in the trillions. They're saying we're going to help provide you infrastructure. China is, by the way, also in the region. So they moved like 10,000 troops to their border. So China has an interest in the Taliban staying neutralized and not becoming a threat to them, and also in gaining power as evil does, right? So we have to, as the United States, should have understood, President Biden, like international relations 101, should have understood what our key enemies in the region were going to be doing. China announced they're going to be building an airport outside of Taiwan and issued a warning to Taiwan. Look, the U.S. isn't going to help you. You're on your own. And that is the message we sent. And Russia... I'm on one right now. And
it's a domino effect. Yeah.
And Russia is doing the same thing. And so now what we have is not just a terrorist state about to be newly established, still establishing in the region that's already, a destabilized region, but we have our greatest foreign enemies empowered, emboldened, and saying so on a public stage. And why is that? It's because our administration is weak. And weak publicly. And Vice President Pence had an incredible op-ed, and he said, weakness inspires evil actors. Like it just energizes them. I don't know if you saw that, Annie, or want to talk about all these things I'm just going off about. But
yeah, no,
you're welcome to join.
No, absolutely. I did see that, and it's interesting because I was speaking with someone and you actually reading some articles, and basically this was something that was perceived to be inevitable. I mean, the argument is, well, no matter what, this was going to happen. We had to pull out eventually, and there's truth to that. But going off on the fact that, yes, the Taliban are very patient. They were willing to wait as long as it took until we stepped out. And as soon as we stepped out, this was their plan all along. But really, it comes down to what was avoidable about the situation. Even though it was inevitable to leave and to pull out, what could have been done differently? And pretty much everything that went down in the past, 8 days was really backwards to what was set up with President Trump. Because as you say, Trump was looking into negotiating and to setting up deals so that, yes, we don't have to stay there forever in America's longest war. We don't have to stay there, more than 21 years ultimately. But the way that it went down really was an embarrassment. I mean, frankly, it was embarrassing to see us, leave the people that had spent the past 2 decades helping us. It was an embarrassment to the people who really were defending our reason for being there. And then ultimately to have that thrown away in just a matter of days is extremely frustrating to watch. But ultimately, the way that it went down could have been very, very prevented, even if the overall withdrawal was not.
Yes, as the British foreign minister said, it's shameful. I mean, that's the only thing to call it. Peyton, you did allude to this a little bit earlier that this was years in the making. And we have this article. It's on pointofview.net, and it was a really, really, I thought, helpful article to understand the history here and how Taliban did over the course of years build into the local communities there, and were very non-threatening and gained a lot of allies at the local levels and the police forces, and started getting their religious ministers were deciding local disputes, and they did this. They planted seeds over time, and they're very intelligent on the marketing side and the propaganda side, and so they did create allies a lot along the way. And then they just released all of their prisoners, former Guantanamo Bay prisoners who were there. Not just Taliban, but so many of their allies are now like in the droves and thousands released from prison, so they're going to be able to act pretty quickly here. Peyton, was there anything you wanted to add before the break?
Yeah, it was like checkmate.
Yeah.
Kind of. They were setting the pieces, and we didn't see the long term or some of it, and they're like, oh, we weren't expecting it if we didn't see that coming. That's kind of embarrassing.
I think it's a lie, though. I mean, we're going to call this out, but I think they did know, because we had General Milley before Congress all summer long saying they just doubled how many counties they're in charge of. They've tripled how many counties they're in charge of. They knew the Taliban were on the move. They had the intelligence and they didn't care. And all these evacuations could have been done 6 months ago. We should just not be in this position. They could have evacuated people. And I heard from the head of an organization who gave them a blueprint for how to evacuate safely and get our troops out safely. And he said, I was ignored. I was told to be quiet, and no one implemented anything they've been given. So we said it's avoidable. It was completely avoidable. There was no reason we should have an emergency evacuation of a U.S. embassy. That could have been done before, right? So
it's also not the first time we've run into this.
Right.
I mean, this is a repeat of what happened in Saigon.
We're going to get back to this when we get after the break because we still have a few things to unpack on this. And then, of course, we'll move on to our other topics.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, and we are full steam ahead here on the Millennial Roundtable discussing what's going on in Afghanistan. And right now we're talking about the avoidability of the things that could have been avoided, planned for, instead of the complete chaos that is now enveloped the country. Some of those things we said were evacuations should have occurred months ago. There were blueprints given to the administration by experts in the field. There's an organization who specializes. It's former military men who served in Afghanistan. They're experts on all things related to the region and the war going on there. And the people, the culture, the religion. I mean, these guys know it all. And he was interviewed and said, all of this was completely avoidable. And we gave those blueprints, we gave those plans to the Biden administration, and we were ignored. We were told to go away, and we were silenced. And that's so unfortunate. One of the things he said is, Biden's in the blame game right now. He's blaming Trump. He's blaming everybody but himself. And the truth is, he said that one of the people President Biden is blaming are the Afghan soldiers for not standing up and fighting the Taliban, and that he said that so many of them turned. Well, the truth is, our stockpile of weaponry, which is now in Taliban hands, because one of the things that could have been avoided was billions of dollars of our weaponry and technology getting into terrorist hands.
Yeah, just equip the enemy.
Yeah, that could have been avoided, but it's not. And that the troops were not equipped with what they needed at the time. For the last few months, nothing was planned for ahead of time. And so while our troops are leaving, they're not also rendering those things into the hands of the army to defend there. And then we know that the local police forces had also for years kind of been undertaken by the Taliban. Annie?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I cannot for the life of me understand what they were thinking when they were pulling out the way they were, leaving tanks, leaving ammunition, leaving intelligence. It'll be interesting to see how this pans out in that in 1996, they did not have this cache of weapons that were, made by the Americans ultimately. And so now we pull out they have all of this ammunition, all of this intelligence, and you kind of wonder what they're going to do with it. It's also, it's a bit of salt on the wound on top of that, just to see, we're chased out of town essentially, and, we're left, and they're left with all of our equipment. So, that was just something that I cannot understand how they could have possibly overlooked that. The negligence in that is unreal to me.
It's complete negligence. I did read an article, though. To be fair, we knew this as voters. That President Biden has had 4 decades of an abominable reputation when it comes to any of our international. His vote was always wrong for 40 years. So much so that former Secretary of State under President Bush is Robert Gates, and he said no one is worse than Biden on international diplomacy and relations. No one is worse than his voting record in 40 years. And we as voters knew that. Of course, I'm never going to end a show without saying, look at what your vote is doing. But people need to keep their eyes open, because he had a bad track record. And under Obama, there were a lot of bad moves already made out there. And so this shouldn't necessarily be a huge surprise, although it is, of course, that it could be such a debacle. But do you have anything to add to that, Peyton?
Not as you said it very, very well.
I'm saying a lot today, but I'm just there's a lot to say.
No, I think it's really interesting too, the conversation we're about to have about if we should have gotten involved from the beginning or not.
Yeah.
And that conversation, how that affects it even with other countries moving forward, as we're looking at China and Taiwan and Russia, and just how all that correlates. And going back to the beginning of 9/11, even with this particular situation, I think that's so important even for millennials to understand, because that was at the beginning of a lot of our lives. And for most of our lives, we've just heard we've been present and had a presence in Afghanistan. So there's been terrorism before 9/11, but for a while it wasn't on our ground. It wasn't affecting us. There wasn't a compelling national interest. 9/11 happened. It was on our soil. That gave us the compelling national interest. And so then we went over there, and it was helping keep terrorism at bay there and keeping the terrorist occupied, so it wouldn't be coming over here and all. And now I just have a concern that that's going to become the breeding ground of terrorism.
What you're speaking to for me is really, I break it down into 2 issues. Is there a moral obligation as a country? The first approach would be isolationist, that there's just no obligation. We're not going to get involved. The second would be, is there a moral obligation to get involved for the humanitarian reasons, for spreading democracy, which President Bush was our president during that season that we really were old enough to understand and remember. And then second, besides the moral obligation, would be our nation's interests in being involved. And, those are the considerations at hand. And I would say that no one involvement is like the other, because we've been saying no country is siloed. And so we might have a moral obligation to get involved when there's genocide occurring in different countries around the world, but maybe not a national interest in getting involved. And this was both. For me, this is Afghanistan is now owned by terrorists. It's a terrorist state. And there are already articles coming out about the training camps that are going to occur there. It's going to be a safe haven internationally in the region for terrorists. So the Paki Taliban are now going to be able to be more free and come over and train. So this does have implications for us. I know that it was very unpopular to continue to be there after 20 years, and that the majority of our population wants our troops out. But we keep saying the way that happened mattered. What do you think, Annie? I mean,
Sure. I mean, I think there is the uncomfortable reality that we're not going into a nation for humanitarian reasons without some sort of benefit, or national interest. I mean, we could make the argument that there is certainly a moral obligation to a degree, whether it be with foreign aid. I don't think that's always, that always manifests in troops on the ground. But I mean, when you look at other countries, I mean, there are countless other nations that are under oppressive regimes. I mean, just to name a few that we all know of, whether it be Darfur or North Korea, Saudi Arabia, several nations in Northern Africa. I mean, there are reasons why we can come up with to go in nations all over the world. A, it's not feasible. B, we can't be world police forever. And we're really not going to go in unless there's some sort of interest. And when we first went in there, again, I think scope creep is a reality that happened with this entire 20-year situation. But when we initially went in there, there was a rally behind the flag, and I think that made a lot of sense at the time. And I think, it was easy to get people behind that. We wanted retribution. But I think going forward, I think we're going to have to take a real hard look at potentially being a little bit more on the libertarian leanings of things. Not to say we should be isolationists, but I think, is it worth looking into how careful we need to be before we just jump in? I mean, and really just see what are our interests long term. What would it look like to be able to get out of the situation? And what ultimately is our responsibility?
Those are the questions that we would expect our commanders in chief, the State Department, the Pentagon, based on the intelligence they're supposed to have, and they do have, to be making those decisions and assessments. Of course, they change from administration to administration. But if this has taught us one thing, it is how precarious the world balance of power is. It is a very delicate thing, and I think that Americans might forget that. They think they're on top. They think they're almost impenetrable. And at the end of the day, weakness, any sign of weakness, is moved upon by evil actors. And that's why you're seeing China and Russia. I mean, the entire world stage and balance of power is completely different than it was 1 week ago today. And that's something we should be aware of and proceed with caution. And that's why the absolute derelict of duty that has happened in Afghanistan is so abominable for so many reasons. But there's no understanding of that, it appears, through our leadership, so much so that our allies abroad, some British ministers were saying perhaps NATO now considers looking at these world issues without one driver, the United States, and perhaps we start moving on and making decisions for ourselves. This is the World War I and happens quickly. World War II happens quickly. So when you see these things happen, I think it's important to just know that there's such a weight behind our position and the president's position. And we're going to go to one of those breaks. When we get back, we're going to round out our discussion here about Afghanistan. We have lots of other topics to cover. We're going to be talking about the Texas heartbeat bill and Gen Z and how they want to discuss race. So don't go anywhere.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to the Millennial Roundtable today. I'm your host, Chelsey Youman, and I've got a brand new guest with us around the panel today. We have Annie Brown. She is on our government relations team with Human Coalition. So thanks for joining us, Annie.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here today.
Yes, we also have Peyton Luke. She's a veteran by now. She's been here a few times. I'm so grateful you're with us, Peyton. She is the media director at Cross Timbers Church.
Thank you for having me, Chelsey.
Absolutely. Well, we have already had an hour of the show, so go back and listen. I would encourage you all to. We have really discussed a lot about everything, all the horrific events unfolding in Afghanistan, from the humanitarian crisis and what it means for the church and women and children in Afghanistan, to the wisdom in being in Afghanistan at all, to the exit strategy. We've talked a lot about what it meant as a proxy war for other neighboring nations in the region, including China and Russia, who are now making really bold moves and strategies. So it has horrible implications for everyone involved on an international and local scale. And we really tried to unpack all of that. A little bit later on the show, we are going to get into the fact that the federal government dropped a lawsuit against a hospital for forcing a nurse to conduct an abortion against her conscience and her religious views. I also have my own article that was published in the National Review about the Texas Heartbeat Bill and what an opportunity it presents, not only to save children's lives, but to serve women in the state of Texas. And then we'll talk a little bit about evangelical students going back to school. They want to talk about the race discussions and learning a little bit about Gen Z, which, as millennials, we are not. We're officially not the youngest on the totem pole to be yelled at anymore. So kind of glad we have another generation there. But before we move on, you can read any of these articles or more at pointofview.net. You can call in. I'd love to hear your perspective. You can agree, disagree, add anything you know that we don't. 800-351-1212. Before we move on, we're going to just wrap up. I said that President Biden was not going to make it out of the show without a good high level of unscathed is the word I used. So we're not done with him. So we're just gonna start here by saying that a great example of how not only avoidable, preventable, and completely chaotic this whole situation has been is the fact that there is a picture going around right now. My friend sent me of a 4-star general who is as high as you can make it in the military. I mean, 5-star is it, but I think there's only like a handful of 5-star generals. They're not traditionally in combat zones. They're such high-level officials that they are at the strategic level. They're highly protected. He is in Afghanistan at the Kabul airport, personally driving a plane of people seeking safe haven out. And so that's just a great example of how unorganized and chaotic this entire situation is. I have infinite trust in our military, but right now at the leadership level, we talked a little bit earlier about General Milley and the level of intelligence. He said he knew all summer long Taliban was making moves and taking over counties, but instead he wanted to talk about race relations and critical race theory. So just how much intelligence do we have or not? And Annie, I know you had a lot of thoughts about President Biden, how he's chosen to act on the intelligence that he did have.
Yeah, no, I think that it's really interesting you say that. You know, you have 100%, faith in our military, but I think as evidenced recently, our president doesn't necessarily have that same faith. And that's extremely frustrating to watch as an American citizen, not listening to our generals. And now we have our generals that are out there and and dealing with the mess that was handed to them. And so, I mean, I am so appreciative of our military, and I just want to throw that out there. And I just feel saddened by the way it's being handled up top. But also, I'm wondering, is Biden even the one really making these decisions? I mean, you had mentioned, of course, you were going over, elections have consequences, and this is who we ultimately elected, and we have to deal with that.
I've always said though that I believe you elect a party, not a person.
Yes,
and so
exactly.
he is propped up by this party. We know he's a figurehead in a lot of ways. So that's a really interesting question. I don't know, Peyton, your thoughts on it, on that point.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Of course, I'm not in the intelligence rooms where these decisions are being made. But of course, I don't think the U.S. military didn't see this collapse coming. A lot of people knew that when we pulled our troops out, there would probably be the Taliban come in and take over. So to your point, Annie, it's okay, is Biden really making these calls? Is it the party as a whole? It's really interesting. And so I think the big part is how fast it happened. And I think with the proper leadership, we could have had a much more graceful exodus.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me sad that he wasn't listening to our military, and again, it could have been completely avoided. But, you wonder, when this was all going down, was it the entire party that was just not listening to our allies, to our military? Did the entire party decide on this, or was this literally him just being nope, this is what we're doing?
I think he selects the head of his administration, right? And so he and his closest advisors are putting all the secretaries in place, and there's a lot that goes into that. There are thousands and thousands of appointees, for instance, that are personally selected by him. And so when we say the administration, it's his selection. Ultimately, he's the one signing it, but he of course has all of his advisors around him speaking to that. We saw President Donald Trump rely very heavily on the advice of his advisors. He almost treated it more like a CEO position, where he said, "You're the expert, I'm not." We saw his business acumen, I think, really play out well in some ways. Now, he had no understanding of limits of power or constitutional boundaries because he was a businessman. Sure. But part of what I thought actually did excel for his administration was the fact that, he did listen to people who were the experts in the room, and he was willing to delegate. And I don't know what President Biden is doing. I know that he's derelicting all of his duties. He's not even answering the questions of the media after his press conferences anymore. I very much question how bad the Alzheimer has gotten, and what a role that has played in his ability to process information and make decisions. But he wanted to get out, and he wanted to get out quickly, and that's what he's done. Yeah. And he's the decision maker. This is on him. I mean, the exodus started in May, so that's squarely in his timeline. And I do want to contest the idea, though, that this was inevitable, because I think that there are commentators and experts coming out saying there's a way to prop up the local government so that when you leave, there's not a power vacuum. So when you leave, the proxy war isn't stirred up again, which we talked about last hour. There is a way to leave a free country there. And that would have been a beautiful thing for the region, for the people of Afghanistan. We talked about our moral obligation to be there for humanitarian reasons, but our national interest in being there, our national interest is certainly served by having a free Afghanistan. And so all that's gone. I do want to just say, we did discuss, you talked about just a call to action. Go ahead with that.
Yeah, I think it's important that we go ahead and still be praying for the nation of Afghanistan, because as horrific as it is, and again, no matter what side you are politically, it's what can we be doing right now as we're watching these horrific things unfold? We need to be praying. How can we support some of the people over there? Right. How can we even be praying for former military that were over there, because also service and valor is never for naught. We kept that at bay for 20 years, and that should be celebrated. Absolutely. So I think it's just important. Also, Americans sometimes have the memory of a goldfish, and the Taliban don't forget anything. They'll remember every offense. So it's just be aware of what's happening and educate yourself in history and be on the lookout, and then ultimately, again, be praying.
Right. I mean, I think most Americans kind of were asleep at the wheel on this, and which is why we're so shocked. But I agree. I think we need to be praying. We have church brothers and sisters over there, certainly, who are going to be impacted. We're going to go to a quick break. When we get back, we're going to move on to some of our other topics for the day. So don't go anywhere.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Two professors, one in the field of medicine and the other in the field of economics, explain why we'll never eradicate the COVID virus. Although this should be obvious, they felt the need to write an essay to explain this and show the fallacy of many government policies. Let's first look at some of the countries that have had the most extensive lockdowns. China has the most severe, even locking people into their homes and imposing a 40-day quarantine at gunpoint. New Zealand also had a very extensive lockdown with sharp restrictions on international travel, business closures, and even a prohibition about going outside. Australia banned international travel, closed schools, and engaged in a brutal suppression of protests. They had limited success, but the virus came back. So did the lockdowns. The medical issue is easy to explain. We won't be able to eradicate the COVID virus or any other coronavirus. The lone human infectious disease we've deliberately eradicated is smallpox. The bacterium responsible for the Black Death, the 14th century outbreak of the bubonic plague, is still with us, causing infections even in the U.S. On radio, I've tried to explain why we were able to eradicate smallpox, but we won't be able to eradicate this virus. This coronavirus is also carried by animals. To eliminate it, we would also have to rid ourselves of dogs, cats, bats, and other animals. And it might also add that only 15% of the world's population have received the vaccine. We may not like hearing that we have to live with the virus, but that is reality, and our public policy needs to be based on that reality. A focused protection policy can help deal with the risk, but it is time to face the fact that a zero COVID policy cannot be achieved. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back. We are rounding out our discussion about the things that are happening in Afghanistan and just how tragic that is. You know, the last thing I'll say on that point is going to be that there is a difference between abandonment and withdrawal. And withdrawal would have been indicating to the world, signaling to the world, to the Taliban, to us, to our allies, victory, right? Like a careful, conscious withdrawal, exiting all of our people beforehand, making sure that the weaponry was in the right hands beforehand. All of that could have been done in such a succinct way that it signaled victory. And instead, through abandonment, it signals that we will not stand and fight with our allies. And after all the skin we had in the game in Afghanistan for their people and for our own country, we're willing to abandon, and we're seeing some big power players like China and Russia move into that space because of that. So if you want to hear more about that discussion, we did discuss it last hour. We went through all of it, but now we're going to move on to an article. We're going to shift gears here that was in New York Times. It did surprise me a little bit that the New York Times put this article out there. It really, for me, was a great piece of, I wouldn't say the gospel message, but almost an evangelizing piece. And it was talking about a guide to finding faith. And he didn't go so far as to talk a ton about Christianity, but he did essentially write this with his audience in mind. And the author is Ross, I do not know how to say his name, Douthat. And he essentially, it's written to atheists. And it's this idea, I think we're in a world where atheism is a little bit on the decline. We have a lot of agnostics around, or hedonism, people who don't believe in anything, but spiritualism is also on the rise. And so we know that people are searching, especially when we look at the world around us, they're searching for substance, they're searching for something to believe in. And he really cuts at the core of that search and the human heart, and what it is in the human heart that does believe in a spiritual realm and why. And I thought it was so fascinating. He's very deep. He's very intellectual. And I hope that atheists or anyone who's struggling with even looking at faith, he kind of talks about the difference between science and faith and how that dichotomy isn't a fair one. And so I'm going to start with you, Peyton. What did you like about this article that really stood out to you?
Yeah, this one's really on my heart because especially with millennials and Gen Zers, and you've seen a gradual move away from the church in general. And a lot of us have a hard time with apologetics and really being able to, why do I believe what I believe if I am a Christian in today's day and world? And I did find this article to be interesting because it's pretty much, a lot of people think if you're an intellectual person, then often they think you can't believe in God because you can't prove it as well. Like, give me the hard facts. And what's interesting too, and again, why this is so important, one for our listeners and also just for conversation in general, I have a George Barna stat, and it says that Gen Z can't reconcile science and religion, and often atheism is doubling at the rate of the U.S. population for within Gen Z. So the Gen Zers, their rate of atheism is doubling at the rate. And they're like one of the biggest generations. So this is important. And when it goes into, I was reading another article that talked about Dr. Francis Collins and how he's actually director of the National Human Genome Research Institute since 1993. And when he was a resident in medical school, he found the Lord because he saw his patients being so resolute in their hope and their faith, even when they were in dire situations. And he ended up, following, C.S. Lewis, who's an atheist, or, The Case for Christ with Lee Strobel. And I encourage all of our listeners, if you haven't read that, or if you're struggling with faith and you want it to be proven to you, go read Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ. He was an atheist that set out to dispute Christianity and disprove it, and he proved it to be right, and he became a Christian. But anyway, it was just fascinating. And this doctor said he found it so interesting what C.S. Lewis said, because if you were an evolutionist and you walk by a pond and someone is drowning, self-preservation would tell you, walk on. Don't get involved with that. And that person, survival of the fittest, they're going to drown. Okay, move on. But there is something within each and every one of us of a moral code of like, even if I can't swim now, I need to do something to save that person. And just the fact, the moral absolute, how can you explain that if there is not a higher being?
Right. I mean, it's a matter of conscience, which is what he discusses in this article. I think you're getting into something so important because what you're alluding to is what we as millennials and I think Gen Z, it's this natural skepticism and it just is mistrust of all these institutions around us. We have been the most marketed to generation in history. It's on our TVs, it's on our phones, it's on our social media, it's everywhere. Even our education is now and has been a gigantic marketing propaganda prop in a lot of ways. So when you think about it, that doesn't lend, the skepticism and cynicism of religious institutions does not lend towards faith. And so I love that he went directly there and said, okay, let's throw out the institutions that you are so skeptical of. Let's throw out all of the things about religiosity that you're skeptical of and think our way into faith is what he said. So thinking, what is it about us as humans? Why do we have a conscience? And you look around at creation around you, and animals are a creation like you, but we're different. Well, the answer to that is we're made in the image of God, and the Bible has a blueprint for that. And so he starts talking about science confirms, it not devalues faith. If you look around us, like the complexity of our universe and the galaxies around us, the complexity of the human eyeball and the way that it functions, the complexity of birth and formation. I mean, everything, it screams that it is created. And so for our world around us to just be, to evidence creation, it implies a creator. And it all is so coordinated. It's not a world of chaos. Everything is coordinated. It's so physics, he talks about how physics really helps orchestrate and organize the world around us. And the more you understand physics over the last few decades and centuries, the more undeniable it is that we are a creation and that the human heart seeks that. Annie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, and I think it's very interesting because I've always really been taught that, religion and science and have always been complementary to each other. Logic and reason is a part of faith. They don't have to contradict each other. And I think that there's this this fallacy out there that it's kind of one or the other. And I think that in the past couple decades, as Peyton had mentioned, with the fallout of religion, I think that maybe that was just almost poor PR in a way, where somehow the message got out that they were conflicting. And I think that, for hundreds of years, that was never the case. The developments that were made, in monasteries, for example, all the science that was developed throughout the centuries, and then more recently, it seemed to be, well, I can't follow because it simply doesn't make sense. Like in the beginning of the article, talking about, well, we all just know there is no God. Where did that come from? Why did that develop into this? Matter of fact, it just can't make sense because it's contradictory with all that we know today. Because today we are so enlightened, and I just think that is such a fallacy that developed over time.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. And I do like where he heads with this, where he says, start by questioning the assumption. The underlying assumption of atheists is that it's just so farcical that God could exist. Right. Mm-hmm. And he said, but start by questioning, is it really that impossible? And he goes through the Middle Ages, which I thought was very poignant of him, and saying, we have if you look at mysticism from the stories of that time, fairies and, unicorns and dragons. All of the mysticism that comes from the Dark Ages, and even in the world around us, we're in a kind of a despiritualized world, but it was very common to see very supernatural events and to see the spiritual realm, but maybe people just didn't know what to call that. And so whether or not you believe in a spiritual realm does not mean it doesn't exist. And so if you, just because you don't believe in it, doesn't mean that there's not evil out there. We're seeing evil in Afghanistan right now. There's evil, and we know that the Bible says that we do not fight kingdom principalities, but that it's a spiritual realm we operate in. And so because of that, he said, looking around as atheists and saying, is there a spiritual, what have I seen in my life that involves the spiritual realm? And he uses in modern era near-death experiences as an example. He says, we all know about the light at the end of the tunnel. We have all these stories of people. There's some guy who did a pretty long-term study of people who had almost died and came back and how changed they were by that experience. And he just talks about the supernatural realm and how undeniable it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's also incredible how you brought up, the miracles and the supernatural, and how in the old days they said fairies. Well, nowadays people are like, oh, this is an extraterrestrial being.
Oh, yes.
And it was like, oh my goodness, it's so funny how people try to perceive it or put natural terms over it. But I just want to read also a quote by Collins really fast, who was, the doctor. And he goes, if God is who God claims to be and who I believe he is, then he is not explainable in natural terms. He is outside the natural world, outside of space and time. So if God chose to intervene from time to time in the natural world by allowing occurrences of miraculous events, I don't see why that is an illogical possibility. Once one accepts that idea that there could be something outside the natural, then miracles also become possible. And C.S. Lewis writes about this so well in his book, Miracles. So if you want to know more about this, check out Miracles.
Miracles. I love it. Well, thank you so much for that. Stay with us, and we'll be back right after this short break.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host today, Chelsey Youman, and we are just flying through topics. If you want to read any of the things we've discussed on the show, whether it's Afghanistan or right now, a really incredible, intelligent piece on New York Times, of all places, about a guide to finding the faith, a little bit outside the experiential realm, but it really focused on the possibility that there's a God and a creator and a supernatural realm and how you get there. So it's a really great piece. You can go to pointofview.net to read that or more. Watch us live on Facebook, or you can call us at 800-351-1212. We do already have a caller. Alex from Kansas is on the line, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, Alex. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for your time. I love it whenever you guest host, by the way.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind, Alex.
So the first thing I would say is this. I'm reminded of what Gustav Ahlund, who was the Bishop of Stroganoff, said in the 1940s, that we will have to change the gospel, not in the sense of changing the message itself, but how we preach it, because we will be preaching to a generation who do not even know who they are.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is, first of all, I'm so glad that you called and told us that, because that's such an incredible point to make, that we kind of take for granted as millennials. And we live in the Bible Belt, so I'm based out of Dallas, Texas, and we take for granted that people have heard the gospel or come from a Christian worldview, or at least are familiar with it. But to the most unchurched generation ever, to the most atheistic generation ever, which is now the generation younger than us, Gen Z, Alex makes an incredible point that we have to start from the ground up, the reason there is a God and a creator and a gospel message, which I think, no matter what, the gospel is truth. I say this all the time, and truth just resonates with our souls as humans. I think truth is rational. It's logical. To your point earlier, Annie, it's science, really confirms the truth we already know, because if God designed everything in a scientific way with a format and in a created way that is organized and makes sense, science is going to reflect that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's interesting, just to start brainstorming, well, what exactly does that look like starting from the ground up? I mean, does it start with missionaries? Does it start, just by, kind of doing, going public? Does it, or, in expanding experiences and influence and just doing what we can for outreach? I don't know. I mean, I just think it's an interesting topic in terms of, where we start. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to his point, to Alex's point, I found it so fascinating when he was saying, we'll be preaching to a generation that doesn't even know who they are, because one of the biggest things with millennials and Gen Zers is identity, and just really understanding who they are, because nowadays social media tells them who they are, entertainment, celebrities tells them who they are. So it's really important for us to have these conversations and these topics and really examine the way that we present the gospel, because we can't talk about it like the Middle Ages or any of the other times in the past, or even in the 50s. We got to make it relevant for them today so they really understand it and have that heart change.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue actually to our next topic we're going to talk about, because I read about Gen Z in this article, and I was so deeply encouraged and hopeful. I was really surprised what I read about Gen Z. I mean, we're millennials, so I think for you out there, we're taking a lot of heat for COVID right now, and that's Gen Z. That's not millennials, okay? So they're the generation right below us. I think, what's our cutoff now of age for millennials? Do y'all remember?
Oh, well, the cutoff year is like 1995 or so.
I've heard that.
So it's around like the 26-year-olds now or so.
Okay.
And then 25 and under, that's pretty much Gen Z.
Gen Z. So Gen Z is now, I think it's the first generation who was not alive or does not remember 9/11. Yeah. They're in college, maybe young adults getting jobs, high schoolers. Yeah. So there's an article we have on pointofview.net it's titled, "Headed Back to College, Evangelical Students Are Eager to Talk About Race and Listen." And so as we're talking about sharing the gospel with generations who've never heard it, don't believe it, largely agnostic, if not atheist, what I was very pleasantly surprised was the glimpse this gave me into the mentality of the next generation. And they're ones who are defined as college students now is who they're talking about. So we'll stick with that age range of college students, inclined to listen. As opposed to being, we're in a very polarized world, polarized environment. They're almost like missionaries, that sounds like, going into their colleges and being willing, they want to have the race discussion, and they're sympathetic to those issues, and they're sympathetic to the LGBT issue. And although, this is a varsity poll that was done, Varsity Christian Fellowship survey said they stick to their values on the issues, but they're willing to engage and have more of a dialogue and listen first, which I think is exciting news. They said that of the 316 evangelical students that are enrolled, they're enrolled in 127 secular colleges and universities, and Varsity Christian Fellowship said after the survey they believe these students are ready. They ranked racism, this was interesting, racism and inequality as the top social concern. This surprises no one after the year we just had. These were young students and individuals in high school. We talked earlier on the show about how impactful 9/11 was to us when we were that age, and the war in Iraq and Afghanistan for us really impacted and molded us. I think all of the race justice issues they're seeing in the news, they're finally old enough to watch the footage and to understand what's going on. I'm sure that very deeply resonated with them. So that was their top social concern. So 40% said racial justice. After that, 40% said poverty. 29% said they thought the environment was a top concern, which is, we can talk about that later. Caring for children was at 28%, and then finally reducing abortion was at 26% the concern. I'm glad reducing abortion made the list. Millennials were the first very pro-life generation. I'm glad to see that torch is now lower to Gen Z. Did that list surprise you guys? What did you think about it?
The first few definitely did not. Like the racism conversation and all that does not surprise me, because there was also another quote in here from the president and CEO of InterVarsity. He said, students don't draw hard borders, sort of thick lines, boundaries between one another. They are willing to cross them, to interact with each other, to do things together. And they want to connect on that personal level, because I think former generations, like, this is my ideology, this is what I am. And guess what? If you don't agree, well, get out of the way, But with this, it's like, let's have these conversations. I've seen people hurt in the past. Like, what is your life experience? It is prideful of me to think that, because you're different, you must have the exact same focuses and ideologies as I do. That's not true. What's your life experience? What's your heritage? What's your culture? Explain to me these things to help me understand. And even if I'm not exactly on the same page, then it's like, I still know what you're going through. I can still relate to you on that personal level. And I think Gen Zers are much more open to those soft conversations.
But it is encouraging too, because, our generation as millennials, at this point we went through the phase of diplomacy, and now there's no, I really used to say dialogue was going to save the world, and it's just not anymore. I'm so just skeptical of that. But maybe Gen Z is more willing to have a dialogue. My hope would be that this is in lieu of Paul's gospel, which is to the Greeks become a Greek, to the Jews become a Jew. You go into a culture. It's almost the Young Life model. I was a Young Life leader, but of gospel ministry, which is earn the right to be heard, build relationships and rapport, and then we speak truth. My hope, though, for Gen Z is that we're not so willing to become diplomats that we lose the truth component. Yeah. Annie, do you think anything along those lines too?
Yeah, we don't want to muddy the water in terms of what we know to be right and wrong. I think is definitely kind of something that to be watchful for going forward. But kind of Peyton had mentioned, which I think was very accurate. I think we would stick within our lanes, in the past, and I think there's a lot of evidence for that. But one thing that really stood out to me in this article, when discussing how they were having meetings on race relations in college, a student said, wow, I didn't even know that Christians cared or talked about this kind of stuff. And I thought, what have we done to lose that kind of, have we been that, lacking self-awareness as Christians? We've been determined to stay in our own lanes. Have we not watched how we're being interpreted? So that it stood out to me, because I'm like, why would people be shocked by that? Why would people be shocked that we want, peace?
I think two things. I have a theory. One is, they're inundated with anti-Christian world around us.
Definitely.
Media. I mean, we are the boogeyman. Okay, we've been called every name in the book: haters, bigots. We're anti-everything. I mean, people have been horrible about the way they speak about us, and out of that, Christians in my circles, from what I've seen with my religious liberty work through some of this, largely silenced.
Yeah,
like
if you
they just don't engage. There's like a fear to engage. We're going to be called names, maybe, but maybe fear.
Yeah.
So that's my theory. I mean, but you're right that is a call to us, you and I as Christians, to say, continue to engage, continue as best as we can in the dialogue, to be active, because we're talking about power vacuums right now in Afghanistan. That's a big metaphor for us saying we have to engage in the political realm. I can't tell you how many people I come across who are Christians and they keep it in the church. And I'm saying we're going to engage publicly. We are going to a break, but right after this, we're going to move on to an article I had published in the National Review. So stay tuned.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to Point of View. We are just discussing how Gen Z is maybe a more compassionate, willing to dialogue generation, as opposed to, us hardened millennials and our skepticism and cynicism. But that there was a study done by Varsity Christian Fellowship that showed how willing to dialogue they are. And then it also came out with a list of like the top areas of concern for them, and their willingness to engage in those areas. So racial justice being one of them, eliminating abortion being one of them. I thought it was very enlightening. So don't forget to go to pointofview.net to read about those. One of the issues they discussed was abortion. So I'm going to pivot pivot now to an area we've been talking about, the needs for Christians to continue to engage, which I know all of you already do. You're listening to the show because you care, you want to know what's going on, you're already engaged, but just that extra level of caring for me about the abortion issue. So I am the National Policy Director for Human Coalition. I do a lot of lobbying work for Human Coalition Action. And one of the bills that we worked on this session had the privilege and honor of supporting and resourcing some of our members in the Texas legislature on was the Texas Heartbeat Bill. We talked about it on the show a little bit. Annie, you were there with me in Austin. It was a grueling session, but really fun. And Texas successfully passed a heartbeat bill that is now being challenged in courts. I hope unsuccessfully. By the way, you're not an attorney, but the number one sign that someone is desperate is if they sue a judge. Not a good sign for a lawsuit. Because would you imagine another judge ruling against judge's liability? No. So Planned Parenthood has done that because essentially the Texas Heartbeat Bill says any abortion conducted on an unborn child with a heartbeat is an illegal abortion. And the way this bill is going to be enforced is not through state actors, which is usually who is sued. It's through private citizens. It's called citizens attorney generals. It's a concept that's done nationwide in other contexts. One of the reasons they did that is because state officials from Texas said, we will not enforce abortion laws. Well, if you have your state government saying we're not going to enforce abortion laws, local DAs aren't going to enforce abortion laws, who's left to enforce them? That's going to be the citizens. So it's a legal concept that's a little bit technical but relevant because Planned Parenthood now has no government to sue for constitutional violations. Only the government can infringe your constitutional rights, not private actors. And so it's really great loophole in the bill. They're apoplectic. They're freaking out, which is what I love the abortion industry to be. But the truth is they're threatening to shut down in their lawsuit. And for me, I say, well, you guys famously tout in my op-ed, which is on National Review, you famously tout that abortion is supposedly only 3% of your services and 97% of your services are serving women. Well, groups like my organization and Annie's organization, Human Coalition, serve women with a holistic approach. We help them get jobs. We connect them to gynecological care early on in pregnancy to make sure they're having healthy pregnancies. We literally do anything and everything for women, help them into housing, out of abusive situations. We have clients who've been homeless, we help. And so that's a holistic approach to serving women. Abortion is not, obviously. And so, I wanted to touch on that. Annie, do you want to add to that?
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting. And I think this is another Shapiro quote, but, you always know who's on the right or wrong side of history, depending on who uses the euphemisms. And I actually, now I'm drawing a blank. I don't remember the name of the representative, but I remember on the floor during the floor debate in the passing of the heartbeat bill that the new argument was, well, it's not a heartbeat. It's an electric signal flutter, and there are variations to that description. They can't even call it a heartbeat. That would be far too humanizing, right? So once you humanize, then you get in very dicey territory. And so, I can defend this as much as I need, so long as I don't admit to the humanity of what's going on. Lack thereof.
I'm so glad you brought that up because the quote is, so the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, who is liberal, so take it for what it is an organization that describes a fetal heartbeat as electrically induced flickering of a portion of the fetal tissue that will become the heart. They go to the greatest lengths. Let's say that's scientifically correct. Like, why can't we call it a heartbeat? Why? Why do we have to go so far? I mean, that's the new clump of cells argument, if I've ever heard it. Technically, it is a clump of cells. I mean, that's not incorrect, but we have to dehumanize because if it's a heartbeat, you're ending a human. Right. If it's a heartbeat, you're killing something. And I think they have to go to that extent because they know in their consciences what abortion is and that it's wrong, but they have to go through these linguistic gymnastics and constant rebranding we've talked about on the show many times in order to to just sterilize what abortion really is. And in this, I just discussed in my article how they have to deny their consciences constantly when it comes to life in the womb, but they are going to bizarre extents now. Do you want to add to that, Peyton?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because to your point, Andy, too, humanizing it, because if we humanize it too, then that baby that is a child has the same rights inside the womb as a human being outside the womb. So they are being careful with that. And just to some of our listeners, so they really understand like how great this bill was and like what the others are trying to come against this. Typically, preborn heartbeats are detected between 5 and 8 weeks of pregnancy. In Texas, 85% of abortions are performed during this stage of fetal development. That means, in practice, the new law will protect tens of thousands of preborn children every year in Texas from elimination by abortion.
It goes into effect September 1st. I'm so excited about this law. I think it could work. There hasn't been a heartbeat bill upheld in the national scale. I think there's like 14 states that have passed them at all. Texas, I don't want to speak too soon because it's still working its way through the court. So we have no real way of knowing how the judges are going to go on it. But there's a real possibility in the state of Texas that tens of thousands of lives are about to be saved every single year starting September 1. Planned Parenthood has a choice before it. I'm challenging them because they're either lying about wanting to serve women and just conduct abortions, which we think is the case, obviously. Or they could take this as an opportunity to do what 2,700 organizations like Human Coalition do every day, which is serve women with real options, real solutions. Because what we don't want to happen is now children to be born into unstable environments or abusive environments. We care about women. We care about these children. We want to stabilize their homes.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think, this is really, a time where we can put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, and really set an example for what it means to really be there for women from start to finish. We don't necessarily have the advantage of the bully pulpit all the time. We don't always have the media, like Planned Parenthood has the media protecting them left, right, and center, But I think that as organizations, pregnancy centers, I think, what'd you say? There are 2,700, pregnancy centers out there similar to Human Coalition that are there. And they're there with open arms ready to, hey, we're here to help you every step of the way,
Right.
And changing that, fighting that narrative of being not just pro-birth, but, there from start to finish.
We outnumber abortion clinics. I think it's 4-1. And so that's telling, and that needs to be out there. Annie, go ahead, tell our audience a little bit about what you do, where you work, and we're going to round out our hour.
Sure. So I have the privilege of working at Human Coalition. I'm really excited to be there. I work as a program account manager. And so I work with various departments and kind of make sure that we're being responsible with our funding and kind of meeting the requirements that's necessary to meet the needs of the state. And it's really exciting because I actually used to work over in our telecare clinic, and kind of be more client facing. And it's just I'm now on kind of a different side of things, but it's really exciting to see how everything operates from an operational standpoint, and also getting to see really build those relationships with the clients as well.
Well, we love Human Coalition. They're a national network of clinics serving pregnant women seeking abortion. You can find out more at humancoalition.org, I think, with them. Go ahead, Peyton, tell us, round it out for us.
Yeah, sure. So I'm in ministry at this time, and I'm the media director at Cross Timbers Church in Valley View. And I just love being in ministry during this time when cultivating that ground and helping the future generations understand who they are and know their identity in Christ.
Yes, and you're about to have a new title.
Yeah, I'm going to be starting at A&M School of Law and the Masters of Jurisprudence program, so I'm excited to join media and law together.
Yes, so exciting. Well, I'm your host, Chelsey Youman. I'm the National Director of Public Policy at Human Coalition. Working to advocate on behalf of women and their preborn children. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.